Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. V-Day. Victory in Europe. America and Britain had won the war. The commies had nothing to do with it, of course. We had toppled the horrible fascists and stood up for truth, justice, and the American way. We freed the Jews and the other minorities from the death camps and helped to rebuild Europe out of the pure kindness of our hearts. We began to question past practices and felt bad about our prior use of concentration camps, including on the Japanese. We had done bad before, but now with this one victory, America had purged itself of all of its past evils, and we were going to do better and be a better nation. A shining beacon of liberty and justice that the rest of the world would all emulate. And just as the war was winding down with no Hitler or Tojo to fear, Harry Truman, who had never really had any foreign experience or ideas, was influenced by a judge who was a conspiracy nut-level anti-communist, or he was just rich and didn't want to have to pay his fair share with anyone else. Either way, after we had teamed up with the commies to defeat fascism, we felt so good about being the righteous knights of justice that we turned our sights on communism and the bloc. Then some traitors gave the Ruskies the bomb and a Cold War descended on America. Just like with the Japanese, we rooted out and blackballed people from working in leadership positions if they even had a whiff of socialist sympathies. Communist equals atheism equals Satanism. You are the enemy now. Just a reminder that the Red Scare started in 1919, not with the rise of Lenin, who at the time wasn't being an extreme dictator like Stalin, but because of the massive labor strike where union busters started spreading anti-socialist propaganda. The Taft-Hartley Act stripped unions of some of their most powerful tools and were turned into a bureaucracy just to prevent people from ever getting fired, and never expanded beyond 1/3 of the nation and was viewed as an elitist, lazy club. In the bill, all socialist or communist sympathizing organizers were stripped of union leadership or their union was disbanded, even though most union members preferred socialist and communist union leaders, even if they completely disagreed with their politics because they were more democratic. That removed 20% of union leaders, and many other good union leaders had been killed in the war. However, we were still the good guys. Our movies and music and documentaries all confirmed it. Why question it? It's what we were fed. And the 3 channels, radio, and papers fueled us with the ideas of heroic bravery and being kind to one another. And American trust in the US government was at an all-time high. The generation that grew up right after the war were the silent generation. Raised during the war and born at the end of the Depression had shaped them to always do their part and trust the government. No one bothered to question the government, and there was the least difference between political parties than at any other time in US history. During the war, with the success of MI6 in Britain, FDR had formed the Office of Special Services. They took care of spies and began to integrate the Department of War's intelligence services. After the war, Truman, against the wishes of the military and the FBI, established the National Intelligence Agency, and its operating name was the Central Intelligence Group. In 1947, the CIG was changed to the CIA and was given special dark money powers, so the money it used couldn't be known or traced, and it didn't have most of the same fiscal rules as the rest of the government. It also created PL-110, a group inside the CIA that had allowed essential aliens to be allowed into the country outside of immigration laws. With Operation Paperclip, they brought in former enemy scientists over to work with the CIA, meaning they brought in literal war criminal Nazi scientists to help them with their projects circumventing immigration law. During the CIA's formation, different parties had different ideas for what the new CIA was supposed to be. Truman wanted intelligence so he could make better decisions. The military wanted them to be military intelligence and covert action, while the State Department wanted to create global political change favorable to the US, and it became all 3. For the first decade, the CIA was mostly a failure, unable to even predict the entrance of China into the Korean War, but they did succeed in funneling money to the Italian Christian Democratic Party and allowed them to win the election. It was a counter to election meddling by the USSR. However, pro-democracy America, right? This became the first in a long-running string of actions that the American people were kept oblivious to purposely. In 1953, President Mossadegh of Iran started privatizing the Anglo-Iranian oil company that British companies had owned since colonialism. The Brits created a blockade, and it pushed Iran into a crisis, as they didn't have workers skilled enough to extract and refine the oil. a common British colonial tactic for centuries to prevent them from reclaiming their own land and resources, which is why it has taken Africa so long to emerge from its dark post-colonial past. Mossadegh took martial law powers and essentially became dictator. That gave the CIA the green light of being anti-democratic and ran Operation Ajax. Remember, Mossadegh was elected. The CIA paid mobs and disgruntled generals to act spontaneously, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. This was a failure, so after that, the CIA paid Iranian citizens to pose as communists, and they would burn and riot and deface things with the Shah's face. This shifted public opinion against Mossadegh, ending his government, and the Shah came to power. This would not be the last time the CIA would pay people to pretend to be the enemy and act horrible. Oh, and after that, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company changed their name to British Petroleum, or BP, and they've never done anything wrong since. With the success in Iran, the CIA was given more resources and power and a roadmap for how to overthrow people we didn't like. In Guatemala, after decades under brutal dictator Obico, where the majority of the population lived like peasant serfs and American fruit companies owned 90% of the land, the people finally revolted, and after several coups in 1944, Guatemala held their first election, and Juan José Arevalo became their first president and began implementing Christian socialist policies modeled after what FDR had done in the US. In 1950, he left office as the Constitution required, and another member of his party, Jacobo Arbenz, was elected to the presidency and continued in the Christian socialist practices. However, many in the military and church held grudges against the elected party. Both presidents Arevalo and Arbenz went to work distributing land that had been stolen and denied to the Guatemalan people, so the United Fruit Companies began lobbying Washington that this was communist. The CIA planned the next operation, PB Success, to overthrow President Arbenz, but the press found out about it after the plans for the operation became public because someone had left the plans out in a Guatemalan hotel. In 1954, Carlos Armas and 480 armed soldiers armed by the CIA crossed the border and began to take over the nation. Radio stations made it sound like the nation had already been taken over, so the people were less likely to fight back or risk angering the new regime. A CIA plane bombed Guatemala City, destroying their oil reserves. President Arbenz ordered the military to hand out guns to citizenry, and the military refused and staged a coup. The CIA orchestrated a few power transfers to make Carlos Armas, who was now beholden to America and the fruit companies, president. This began the Guatemalan Civil War from the 1960s to the 1990s, where America continued to back the brutal, repressive puppet regimes for the fruit companies to continue owning 90% of the land and keep the people as peasant serfs. 200,000 people died in these fights, mostly by a US-backed military, and currently Guatemalans are fleeing their wrecked home nation to flee to our border, and because people don't know the CIA's history, are blaming them for their terrible nation and sending them back to almost certain death. Next, the CIA backed a coup in Syria, but 4 years later, the military, Baathists, who are a hybrid of Arab nationalism and socialism as well as communists, overthrew the government. After the Suez Crisis, people in the CIA payroll in Syria came on television and let everyone know that the CIA's efforts and past efforts to stage a coup in Syria, causing closer ties with Egypt, creating the anti-American Arab League. Just a reminder that the American press was barely covering any of this, and the American people barely knew anything about what was going on, or just trusting that the government was doing the right thing. Next, under direct orders from President Eisenhower, the CIA tried to stage a coup in Indonesia, a country that tried to remain a neutral party in the Cold War, which made him a commie sympathizer in the eyes of the US, creating the term subversion by democracy. The CIA lied 3 times to the president about the situation on the ground, and the American people that the fairly elected president was actually a communist dictator. After the failure, the CIA had more distrust from the president and the rest of the government. In the newly freed Democratic Republic of the Congo, after decades of the most brutal slavery by King Leopold II and then the Kingdom of Belgium, the newly elected Patrice Lumumba asked the West to help him in a covert Belgian-backed military succession of the newly formed Republic of Congo that was a breakaway territory. The West refused and ignored his pleas, so he took help from the USSR. This, of course, made him a communist, and Ike mentioned that he wished Lumumba was gone. The CIA and Belgian operatives kidnapped him and dropped him off in enemy territory where he was killed. They then gave $250,000 to Joseph Mobutu, who became a strongman, brutal, crazy dictator till the late 90s, and the Congo is now slowly dragging themselves out of this hole and damage this did to them. The Congo had the resources that should have made them the Wakanda of Africa. Instead, because of US and Belgium corporations wanting these resources, they lost half a century more to brutality and an oppressive regime that has led to being one of the poorest, sickest, and least educated people in the entire continent of Africa. Eisenhower blocked the flights of U-2 spy planes so that it didn't increase tensions with the USSR, but the CIA put pressure on him to let them fly over and find out if they had more nukes than the US, for fear there was a missile gap between the Ruskies. Finally, Eisenhower caved and gave them a 22-day window to do their surveillance work, but the U-2 was shot down, and Eisenhower's credibility as an honest man to Khrushchev was dashed. This ratcheted up tensions in the Cold War to a new level. Next, and probably the first good operation the CIA did, the Dominican Republic had spent 3 decades under a brutal dictator, and they were able to get him killed with guns supplied to them. However, they had no plans on how to steer the nation after that to give them democratic elections, creating a civil war that killed 11,000 people. This made the CIA under Johnson to come and occupy the island and institute elections that would ensure no socialists or communists would come to power. The former dictator's puppet president, Joaquin Balaguer, was elected and went back to abusing their human rights, picking up where the last dictator had left things off. And just a reminder, the American people knew pretty much nothing about this, and it was really hard to find these details if you didn't live outside the nation. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis 2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.